afternoon. I'm Dara Berger, your host of the Every Choice Counts podcast. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm the author of the book, How to Prevent Autism, documentary filmmaker, passionate health advocate, and mother of 2 children, one of which developed autism immediately after a vaccine reaction at 18 months where he had 2 ischemic strokes. And I am very excited about today's show with our special guest, Dr. Paul Thomas, who's going to talk about his new book, The Addiction Spectrum, all about treating addiction from a whole body perspective using integrative medicine. So Dr. Paul Thomas received his MD from Dartmouth Medical School. He is a board-certified fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics and a diplomat of the American Board of Addiction Medicine. He taught residents and medical students from 1988 to 1993 and has practiced pediatrics for over 30 years. In 2008, he opened Integrative Pediatrics, where he currently serves over 13,000 patients, and in 2009, his Fair Start Clinic, where he helped over 500 patients with opiate addiction in the Portland, Oregon metro area. He is the founder of Pediatric Health Outcomes Initiative. He is also the founding director of Physicians for Informed Consent. He is the author of the Vaccine Friendly Plan, Dr. Paul's Safe and Effective Approach to Immunity and Health from Pregnancy Through Your Child's Teen Years with Jennifer Margulies, and The Addiction Spectrum, a compassionate, holistic approach to recovery. Welcome, Dr. Thomas. I am so excited to have you here on the Every Choice Counts podcast and to hear all about everything that's in your new book.
Well, thanks, Dara, for having me on your show and your podcast. I love the work you're doing. It's so important that we empower people with information so they can make great informed decisions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And let's dive right in. So what compelled you to write the book, The Addiction Spectrum?
Well, many of your viewers might know me as also the author of the Vaccine Friendly Plan. I'm a pediatrician, board-certified pediatrician. I was trained at Dartmouth and then residency in California. You know, my whole pediatric career was let's help kids, and I noticed kids weren't doing so well. And so that book deals with vaccines, autism, chronic disease, and sort of a different way of doing things. And then I have a personal story with addiction, both personally myself, and then it's in my family, and also in my practice. What I was noticing over and over again was that, you know, these children who were hyper inattentive as young children. I have a practice of 15,000 patients in Portland, Oregon, and I have over 1,000 of those kids would qualify with the ADD or ADHD diagnosis. I was that way as a kid, by the way, so most of these kids, anybody that's on this spectrum, whether you're starting at mild ADD, ADHD, all the way to severe autism, these are super intelligent kids. They're just challenged by our current world. We have genetic vulnerabilities. You cover those so nicely in your book. And then you add the toxic world we live in, and you throw in so many vaccines so soon that overstimulates the immune system, immune activation too young, which affects brain development, plus the direct toxicity. And then just all the things in our world, right? Foods that have pesticides and herbicides, our air, our water. People are vitamin D deficient. There are other nutrient deficiencies. This sets these kids up for having challenges in the neurological development area, so we're looking now at that subset of my practice, say 1 in 8 kids now, 1 in 8 to 1 in 10 have ADD or ADHD, 1 in 45 roughly have autism or autism spectrum. I mean, folks, this is nuts, right? It wasn't like that when I was growing up. I didn't know a single autistic kid. When I was in medical school in Dartmouth in 1981 to 1985, guess how many autistic kids I saw? 0. I don't remember a single class about it, and I didn't skip class. I was not one of those people who skipped classes, and I don't remember reading about it in a single textbook. And now it's everywhere. Anyway, back to your question. I really digressed, didn't I? Sorry about that.
No, that's very interesting information.
So,
with your book.
Yeah. So to tie it into your question and how I ended up writing a book on addiction, I'm noticing in my practice that my teenagers are struggling. They are anxious, they're depressed, they're struggling with ADD, ADHD, and they're tending towards addictions. So those of us who have that, I was that way as a kid, right? So let me tell you a little bit of my personal story, which then sort of explains why I was interested in this topic. I grew up a missionary kid in Africa. I was blessed with the most protective, safe environment a kid could ever dream of. I mean, I'm in a village for the first 4 or 5 years. Then I'm in a mission area where they teach theology and, you know, they're turning out preachers. And I mean, I was just safe running in the wild with friends and no access whatsoever to drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, any kind of substance that could lead me into that addiction world. Then I went to high school at a very top boarding school on a mountain in Swaziland. There was zero access to drugs or alcohol. I mean, there was no way. So I was completely sheltered. Fast forward, I come to the United States for college. I discover beer, girls too, but no, I'd found them before that. But I discovered alcohol, and I loved the effect. And so for my kind of spinning brain and just hyperactivity, I didn't know then, but I'm an anxious type person, very high energy, very anxious type, and it just sort of, that's better, right? And if you've had that experience with a substance, you know what I'm talking about. I want more of that, right? So I would hit it hard, but I was still a very motivated student, so I would only drink once a week, way too much at that stage. Long story short, I eventually was drinking alcoholically daily, and it became a real problem. So I'm now 15 years sober. I've got that behind me. I'm vigilant, though. I'm never going back. What I noticed was, in my practice, I'm seeing these teens heading down that same path. I'm seeing it with my own kids. I'm seeing it in my family. And I started an addiction practice to help young adults get off of heroin, because so many were falling into that trap, which wasn't one of mine, but there was nobody helping these kids. So I gained a lot of experience helping kids get off of heroin, get healthy again. And so that was this sort of the impetus to, you know, we need to get this information out that addiction is happening to all of us, and it also happens on a spectrum. So we can chat more about that as well.
And I was very surprised to read, just right off the bat, I think people don't understand how many people are killed by addiction every year. It's a very large number. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think most people aren't aware. Yes, we keep hearing about the opioid crisis, and it's really terrible, but I don't think people understand the numbers.
Yeah, the numbers are tremendous, and they're quite scary. 2017, there were 72,000 overdoses just in that 1 year. 30,000 of those are new in the sense that they're caused by fentanyl. And that's a relatively new phenomenon. And by the way, that 72,000 is up from 63,000 a year before. So that's 9,000 more overdose deaths in just 1 year. And it's still at that very high level. So we are in a huge crisis with opioid addiction. And yet, there are other substances that are killing more people. Right? So in our state, methamphetamine is actually a bigger problem. Alcohol worldwide, by far, the biggest killer, at least a couple million people a year. And the one I'd like to highlight for you, and I've got a chapter in my book, the book's The Addiction Spectrum, that we don't think about is screens. Let me tell you a story, because this will just hit, I think it'll hit you like it hit me. I have a young girl sitting in my practice. Actually, no, I'm going to start somewhere else. Just this week, last week, on one single day, so I'm a busy pediatrician, but I can only see 25, 30 patients max in a day. On one single day, I had 6 teenagers, new visits for anxiety, depression, suicidal, and focus issues. 6 new visits. They'd never seen me or another doctor for that problem in one day. And it just blew my mind. So now I'm going to go to a story a few months ago that just was like, wow. So I have a young lady in my practice. She's 16, and she came in for anxiety and depression, and she was feeling suicidal. and she couldn't go out. She couldn't get to school even anymore. She had been a patient of mine since she was a baby, came from a family that was all into sports and healthy eating, and she had lots of siblings, and she was always a happy kid, and she was completely flat, no expression. She was in trouble. She was suicidal. She'd been to a psychiatrist. She was on 2 different antidepressants, high dose, and she couldn't get out of bed to go to school. So, I'm talking to her about all the things I can think of that might be helpful. Eat real food. Make sure you're getting your nutrients. Are you taking enough vitamin D? Getting your sleep. Get some exercise. I mean, she didn't have the energy to get out the door. Fix your microbiome. And you've got to work on reducing your stress. Well, she comes back. We made a couple adjustments. She comes back a month later, and she is like literally bouncing off the seat. I'm like, I actually thought it was one of her sisters, because she has a couple sisters that are pretty close in age who look close enough that I can get confused. And I'm like, no, weren't you here last month? Yeah, I was here. Weren't you like super depressed? Yep, that was me. I've never seen such a transformation. I said, what did you do? Oh, I don't know. You reduced my meds a little bit. She had 2 high-dose meds. I reduced one a little bit. But that wouldn't do it, folks. I mean, I've been helping people with med adjustments for 30 years. It's not going to do it like that. Then the mom says, well, remember, honey, last time you were here, you left the office, you tried to go play soccer, and you had that concussion. So she had a major concussion and went to the ER. It was bad enough she was knocked out, had an MRI of her brain, and she was told total brain rest. You go home and you go to bed. No screens, no phone, no computers, no school, no reading, no friends over. Total brain rest. And her brain did what? It completely healed. I was like, wow. How much time were you spending on your phone? Oh, quite a lot. I said, how much is quite a lot? Probably too much. How much is probably too much? 7 or 8 hours a day on school nights. Now, folks, those other 6 kids I told you about, the least amount of time was 4 hours and the average was 6 to 7 hours. This is what's happening in our youth today and young adults too. And let me just explain it this way. We're animal kingdom creatures wired to scan for danger. I mean, our innate, the major part of our subconscious brain that just functions on its own is wired to what? Make sure we stay alive, scan for danger. So when you're on that phone, the biggest stressor here in the world. So when you're on that phone and you're like, scrolling or flipping or instant messaging or even watching YouTube, or kids who are video gaming, right? This is constant little danger signals, and it just trashes the neurotransmitters, sometimes to a point of no return. Examples being that young lady I just shared with you. So that's another example of an addiction that's devastating people's health that most of us don't even have on our radar.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I try to limit my own screen time every day. I'm so happy when I'm in the car or I'm making dinner and the phone is away. I'm totally in agreement with you. Now let's talk about, because that is one of many things that you point to in your book about why there is such a problem with addiction and mental health issues today. So can you give us an overview of just some of the areas? And then, of course, we're going to get more specific, but screen time is definitely one of them. And tell us why, because you talk about the social isolation.
So I talk about 6 or 7 factors that are so key to health in general. So you've got to think of addiction like a chronic illness, because that's what it becomes. It doesn't start that way, so I called the book The Addiction Spectrum just to highlight the point that no matter what it is you might become addicted to, you're not like on or off, you're addicted, right? There's this journey. My own with alcohol was protected until I was in college, and then I started pushing the limits and I started moving till I reached some point in that addiction where I could not stop. I'd reached that point of no return, if you will. And in that instance, for me, it had to be all or none. But there are factors that make us more vulnerable to addiction, and they're actually the same factors that make you more vulnerable to autism spectrum, ADD, ADHD, frankly, heart disease, cancer, autoimmunity. You name me a chronic disease, and these factors are probably very, very important. So why not just look at them and deal with them, right? We want to be healthy. I think everybody wants their kids to be healthy. If we're talking about kids, if you're talking about yourself, don't you want to have that vibrant health you once had when you were a young child? Of course we all do. So what are these factors? And in fact, when I sit with new prospective moms and dads, because I'm a pediatrician primarily, I do some addiction work about half to 1 day a week. But in those prenatal visits, this is when you want to do the absolute best for your unborn child, and you want to give them the best start in life possible, right? And these same principles apply to each one of us. Number one, eat real food. Organic if you possibly can. I mean, we are magnificently made to be healthy if we give the body the nutrients it needs. So that's number one. And there's a whole host of books that will highlight what's more important, like dark green leafy vegetables are so important in so many ways, but make it sure it's whole food. Like, think of yourself as a hunter-gatherer. I mean, just make sure it's real food. If it's from a box, a can, a bag, it came from a factory. All right, real food. Every single one of us, unless you're supplementing, is vitamin D deficient. You can't get enough vitamin D from milk. You'd have to drink 4 or 5 gallons, and it's not well absorbed that way anyway. So vitamin D is actually a hormone. So, like, if you had to take one thing, make sure it's vitamin D, and people are not supplementing enough. You want your levels to be high enough that they're making a difference. I make a point, I think I put it in the book, of making sure your vitamin D has K2. When there are studies that show problems with vitamin D, it's probably because they did not include K2. Vitamin D, in addition to being a hormone, and there's VDR, vitamin D receptors in our brain, in our nervous system, all over the body, our immune system, white blood cells. So in addition to the benefits of it being an actually important hormone, it helps us absorb calcium. And you absorb calcium better, that's a good thing. Therefore, you don't need to be drinking tons of milk. You can get calcium from your other real food. And however, if you don't have the K2, which helps calcium be stored in the bone, then maybe that's why there's some conflicting studies that would show vitamin D can be a problem. Just take vitamin D with K2. I take 5,000 to 10,000 IUs a day. I wouldn't recommend that for you. You check with your own provider. I'm not giving a treatment recommendation here, but in my babies, we're starting at 1,000, and by the time you're teenagers, most kids do great on 5,000. You just check the levels so you're sure you're not overshooting it. And the goal is 50 to 80. Normal is 30 to 100, but 30 is deficient, folks. You need to be over 50. So eat real food, supplement your vitamin D. The big one is stress reduction. What is stressing you out in your life, right? What can you do to minimize that stress? The biggest hidden stressor, we talked about it, those screens, right? So just do everything you can to minimize that. And then there's tons of stressors that some of them we can't avoid. If you're a student, you have to go to school. If you're a working parent or an adult, you have to go to work usually. But there's a philosophy you can adopt that will really help you reduce stress, and that is give it your best and let go of the results. Man, I wished I'd learned that when I was younger. I didn't figure that out till actually the alcohol problem bit me, and I was in my early 40s, and I was just like, wow. Trying to get into medical school was just a battle for me. And, if I had just worked at the same level of intensity and let go of the results, I would have still gotten there. Right? So it's an attitude thing. So you're going to eat real food, supplement your vitamin D, do everything in your power to reduce stress. There's toxic people, maybe they can be arm's length away. And then we all need restorative sleep. Most people are not getting enough sleep these days, or it's not good sleep, it's interrupted sleep. So just work on that. Exercise is super, super important. If you're not exercising at all, just start. Do something, walk, I don't care, just get moving, and then see if you can find a way to do exercise in community, because it's so much fun if you're doing it with someone else. I joined CrossFit, had an injury, said, this is too hard for me, I'm not going to do it again. Then my wife, who'd been a couch potato for 30 years, gets talked into CrossFit by my son, who's coaching, and she goes, come on, honey, you got to come back and do CrossFit. I'm going, oh, no way, I'll hurt myself. And I said, all right, you stick with it for a month, I'll join you. By golly, it's been over a year. She goes 3-4 times a week. She's transforming herself. It's just unbelievable. And the energy it's restored into her life, and the fitness that's come back, the vibrant health. So find something that you can enjoy doing, but if you do it in community, that helps, which brings me to the final point that you started me off on. Sorry I've rambled so much. Community. when it comes to addiction, isolation is probably the absolute worst thing. So I give the example in the book of the rat park experiments. And these were just so, like, it was like, yeah, that makes sense. So Bruce Alexander in Canada back in the 1980s did some experiments. He took rats, and when they were isolated in a solitary cage, which is, most research facilities just have lines and lines of rats, each in their own cage, and he gave them the option of water or morphine water. The rats, by and large, would drink morphine till they died. They just became very quickly addicted. They were just trying to feel better. That living in isolation for a rat is not normal. Well, then he would take those same rats, put them in a rat park where they had a place to play, wheels to run, places to hide, places to mate, options for food, and still gave them the choice of water or morphine water. And they would choose water so they could have their social engagement and just be a regular rat, I guess. And he could even take rats, get them addicted to morphine, put them in the rat park, and they would detox themselves and drink water. So, folks, we are social creatures just like those rats. And if you put someone in isolation, that's a huge stress. And I thought back about it. In fact, I was doing so well till I got to the States on my own in isolation in some respects. And I reached for some relief. So I don't know if that's at all a valid thought, but I think it is in retrospect. So we need good social connectedness. It's important for all of us.
And that's exactly what's the issue with the screen time, which is you're isolated, you're at home, you're texting, none of it's real, it's all virtual. And, you don't have the emotional affect behind the comments, and it's just, it's terrible for our young people. Now, what I love about the book that you go into is the spectrum, where because people don't usually, you explain, go from mild to severe overnight. Can you explain so people can, not to diagnose themselves, but to kind of get a feeling of where they fall on the spectrum? If we could start with mild, what is that person who's addicted mildly like?
Addiction's probably too strong a word for mild spectrum situations. Because I think what happens initially with, whether it's a substance or a behavior that's addicting, has those properties. So first of all, why is it addicting? So why is it alcohol boosts dopamine and GABA. Opiates boost dopamine big time, and also relieve pain and help with focus. And meth is a humongous booster of dopamine, like 100 times. And so this is why that one can be so quickly, devastatingly addictive. You can almost go from zero to fully addicted on something like meth. It's just so horribly addictive because the massive flood of dopamine is apparently, I will never risk it. I wouldn't want to take that chance, but apparently it's so overwhelmingly that euphoria that you just have to chase that again. If you have that addictive tendency, or maybe if you're in pain, whether it's physical or emotional pain, and you're just looking for relief. But whether it's so take a more of a behavioral thing, the screens or gambling, there are people, I think twice in college, I was in California and I went up to Lake Tahoe to gamble because this was a fun thing that I was told. And I could take it or leave it. In my instance, I played blackjack for a couple hours. And so am I addicted to gambling? No. Am I a potential gambling addict? Probably. Probably. If you put me in the right environment and you isolate me, let's say I lived in Vegas or I lived in near the casinos, and I was isolated and I was just, and I had the access. When you gamble, that thrill of maybe winning gives you a little dopamine boost. Okay? Food. 2/3 of America is overweight, right? I struggle with it myself still today. If I eat like I know I'm supposed to, I'm fine. When I go dig into the breads and the pastas and the cookies, crackers, chips, desserts, and what have you, I start putting on weight. It can go on really fast. So I have to be vigilant. And on that one, I'm constantly making sure I'm not sliding into addictive patterns of just taking your substance to feel better. And then what happens we'll talk about the food. I see it in my office. Work with 35 women. I'm the only guy there. And guys are just as bad. But anyway, there's just all this sweets and cookies, and especially the holidays. And when you eat highly processed foods or sweets, you get an insulin spike. First of all, that little hit of dopamine, you can have a little tiny dopamine from sugar and from sweets, and it feels good, right? That's why we do it. But then your blood sugar drops and you start having shakes or just subtle, I don't feel as good. You eat a little more, you feel good. So when you start experiencing more and more withdrawal, you're moving along the addiction spectrum, right? And depending on the substance, that withdrawal can be so intense. In the case of opiates, most heroin addicts, or if you've been using high-dose pain pills for a long time, you won't be able to go through withdrawal on your own. You will have the most severe shakes, chills, body aches, twitches. Think of the worst flu you've ever imagined and multiply that by 10. You just will finally need to function again. You can't function. You can't go to work. You can't do anything. So you find some opiates somehow, some way, and you feel better, right? So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that you're going to keep doing this, because your experience is that when you take your heroin or your pain pill, you feel so much better. What it ends up that it's doing, same as actually true for alcohol. We associate alcohol with fun if you're a drinker. And think about it. Most people pair fun activities with alcohol. And so it gets this reputation for being able to create fun. But really, you can have just as much fun or more not drinking. The fun was the fun. The drinking was just drinking. But once you've been drinking steadily and frequently or daily, when you don't have it, you don't feel as good. All right, so this is where I got at the end. I felt just kind of dull, like a dull headache, low energy. It was subtle withdrawal symptoms. And I would take that first drink and instantly feel better. So I was moving along the spectrum of severity in my alcohol addiction at that point to where there was clear withdrawal symptoms, and my substance, in this case alcohol, helped. It helped those withdrawal symptoms. But it's a slippery slope with many substances. I don't know if I answered your question well, but
you did. I think one of the most interesting things that you mentioned in your book was how you hear one story over and over, how addiction gets started. Can we talk a little bit about someone who goes to the doctor, whether they've been in a car accident, whether they just, they have some kind of pain, and give us the scenario, no matter what their age is. They could be 18, they could be 40. What happens?
Yeah. So physicians, I being one, we were trained so well the last 2-3 decades that pain is a vital sign. And if we leave you, the patient, in pain, we're a bad doctor. And we are such pleasers. Doctors are the worst. Nurses too. We want to take care of you and we want to please you. And we certainly don't want you to be in pain. So we were trained to write large prescriptions so that you don't have to suffer. Well, when you're talking about pain pills, when you have real pain. So I had a major shoulder surgery 4 months ago. It was the worst pain I've ever imagined. They had to reattach a 2-inch tendon that was tore off the bone. That was CrossFit again, by the way. I'm going to be more careful next time. But, and there will be a next time. I want to get back to the fitness was so fun. But anyway, they drill plastic screws into my bone that are hollow. They scrape the bone so blood will come out, and they want bone marrow seeping through these hollow plastic screws so it'll attach that tendon back onto the bone. Well, folks, that pain was so intense I could barely get off the couch to function. It was unbelievable. It was appropriate to have pain meds, and those pain meds helped immensely, but I never once felt, oh, this feels good. We were just trying to manage pain. So opioids have a place. As I speak here, I just wanted to make that clear. Now, fast forward 2 months later, I was only struggling at night. I could work without any pain meds. The pain was there. It was bad, but manageable. 4 months, I haven't had a pain pill in weeks, right? So, but had I had a doctor who just kept giving me as much as I wanted, and I have this addictive tendency, I would not be surprised that I would switch over now and become dependent on those opiates, so that it gets to the point, and here's the tricky part with pain. When you take a lot of opiates, you actually recruit new receptors, new opioid receptors. So these are pain receptors. And now actually your pain is magnified, and you need more opiates. This is the development of tolerance. You need more opiates to have the same amount of pain relief. So you'll see this happen when someone's getting addicted, when they've had a real surgery, a real need for pain pills, and somehow along the way, if you're on them steadily every day for too long, and too long could be a week or two, or it could be a couple months, but there comes a point where if you stop, you have withdrawal symptoms. And the withdrawal symptoms, when you've been through surgery or have had major real pain, always seems at first to be just like your pain. So if I was dependent and withdrawing, I bet you it would be my shoulder that would hurt. And so then I would think, oh, I need more pain meds. And it gets all confused. So the problem, I think half of the opiate addiction in this country or more is started off by legitimate surgeries, injuries, doctor-prescribed opiates. When the doctor finally realizes you're addicted, they usually cut you off, and then you're left just, right, withdrawal and not able to function. So you do what? You go to the street and find some relief. Heroin is so cheap in America these days, that's what people are ending up on.
Yeah, and you talk about something interesting, which is the heroin addict looks different. And I can tell you personally, I had a best friend in high school that went on from, smoking pot, went from alcohol, pot, and eventually she went off to college. I guess she must have got hooked up with a bad crowd. And this was just a girl from a regular, a neighborhood, and she was a heroin addict for like 3 years, living on the streets. Occasionally she would call me, and that's how I even know. Thank God she had a baby, she got pregnant, and it changed her life. And and we're going to talk a little bit about, she was on methadone for years, and we're going to talk about why some of the mainstream, recovery methods don't work. So you do a whole body perspective, which is so interesting. I love the fact that you talk about, you try to find the root of the addiction. Is it emotional? Is it genetic predisposition, just like with autism? Is it stress related, social, environmental? And I love that. And can you talk a little bit about how you got to this integrative practice with treating addiction? Because it makes so much sense.
Well, I owe that to actually my journey as a pediatrician and discovering that our kids weren't doing very well. And the fact that today 50% of kids are graduating from high school on a chronic medication, I mean, that's just nuts, right? So our current society, our current system is failing, and our health system. So waking up to that aspect in pediatrics, then as I started off with seeing that it was affecting teenagers and young adults, with ADD, anxiety, depression, and then addiction, and then seeing it in my own family, I also realized that the current treatment model, so I became board certified in addiction medicine. Maybe I'm an overachiever, I don't know. I didn't need to do that. But I wanted to try to understand addiction at every level and make sure I was well educated. And what I've seen in that world of your addiction specialists, and I'm not putting an addiction specialist down, we need them. And if you are so severely addicted that withdrawal could kill you, don't try to do that at home. So the severe alcoholic, the really severe opioid addict, although it's very unlikely to die from an opiate withdrawal, it's more the overdose that will kill you. But get help, right? There are some people who need to be detoxed in an inpatient environment. But the treatment modality, what we call medically assisted treatment, the methadone clinic, the high-dose buprenorphine, which is a partial agonist. It's the medical model where here's your pill and here's your solution, and good luck, or go away, come back tomorrow. And it's based on it. I think you got to follow the money in medicine. When we were taught to treat pain as a vital sign, that was a concerted effort by the company that made Concerta. It was a long-acting, not Concerta, sorry, OxyContin. a little boop. OxyContin was this long-acting preparation of opiates that they said was non-addictive. And so then they had this whole campaign to just treat pain and everybody's going to get better. Well, we created a disaster. Well, now we're treating these opioid addicts with either methadone or buprenorphine. And by the way, I use buprenorphine in my clinic, but I tie it in with this holistic approach because I'm finding when I just used buprenorphine, very few made it. They relapsed and then they disappeared. And were they overdosing and dying or what? And now I have very little relapse, almost none, and nothing scary anymore because people are engaged in their own health. But the harm reduction model of addiction treatment for opioids, it's worth, let me just highlight that very briefly for you. You go to a methadone clinic and they give you low dose at first, and then they rise your methadone level up fairly quickly to beyond what's even medically logical. So they will take your methadone dose so high that every opiate receptor is flooded with methadone, and if you were to go use, it would be pointless because it will have zero effect. They've already got every receptor loaded. And basically you've got a, government-sponsored opiate prescription for life. And they want you on it for life because that way you won't go out and use heroin, share needles, share HIV and Hep C. So we are reducing harm to society. Now, the fact that we've just sacrificed your life, it is not a life of, the pictures of these people they use to advertise this are these people who are dancing in the hills, happy. No, you see a methadone person, they are so, overdosed. They're out of it. And they have to go every day. They're chained to their addiction. It is not, you wouldn't wish that on your worst enemy. Yes, if you've been doing heroin for 50 years and you're at the end of your life, go ahead, just take your methadone. It makes sense. But I'm dealing with young adults, and they were being taken to opiate, might as well be a heroin clinic, methadone clinics, and being put on these high doses and being, it's insanity. So what I do is I use the tool of buprenorphine, which is a partial opiate. So we call that an agonist, where it gives you a somewhat of an opiate effect, but it's also a blocker. Think of it as it blocks half the receptors, it activates half. You cannot overdose on it if you are already an opiate user. Obviously, if you've never had opiates, don't go taking buprenorphine. You could overdose. But it's very, very safe to use for that reason because it only can get half the receptors because the other half are blocked. And very slowly wean their dose down while we work on these things of food and supplements and your genetic risk factors, minimizing stress, huge. And that environment that you have, right? So people have gotten isolated by the time they're coming to my clinic and they're addicted to heroin. So, I've seen in my practice they're getting jobs again. They're getting their kids back, those who've lost their kids, which is a lot of times the case. And they're actually paying rent. I mean, it's just like amazing. They get their lives back. And I don't rush them off of the buprenorphine because it is giving them a little support of that opioid system, but you get them down to such low doses that it's totally safe.
It's so interesting because your approach to healing someone with addiction is very similar to the approach of healing someone from other diseases, other illnesses. It's
yes.
Very interesting that it's the same umbrella and it's the most basic things that make sense that you do, and you're going to feel good. Your body's going to feel good. Can we talk a little bit about what are the risk factors that can send someone to an addiction state?
Addiction. I would say the genetic risk factors are actually the same ones as we have for autism, for heart disease, for autoimmunity. If you have the MTHFR, especially if you've got the C677T from both parents, you're just at super high risk for having problems with your neurotransmitters. And, that's the same risk factors for some of the autoimmune stuff. COMT is another one that seems to affect mood a lot. So anything that makes you real prone to anxiety is going to make you real prone to addictions. I think the environmental piece is huge. My example, case in point, being isolated in a village and then on a mountain in Swaziland in Africa, I mean, I had no access, right? So there's no question that if you can protect early introduction to substances of abuse is a huge, huge risk factor. If you start, so many studies show, like even marijuana that's now legal here in Oregon, if you started in your mid-20s, it's very unlikely you'll be addicted. But if you started in your teen years, it's not only is your addiction likelihood higher, but the chance of permanent brain damage is higher. So having a safe environment is really important. And I think what's protective about the other risk factors that are shared by all the chronic diseases, the good nutrition, getting your nutrients, avoiding stress and sleep and exercise, these common sense things that most of us don't do well. If you don't have that general health taken care of, then you're at risk for not feeling well. And when you don't feel well, you want to feel better. So you're going to reach for something. I use with my addicts a little mnemonic called HALT, H-A-L-T, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. If you want to remember 4 things to avoid, don't go around hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, because you're going to look for relief. Right? And so when your relief was X, Y, or Z, whatever you're addicted to, if it's food, you're going to reach for some food. Well, if you're hungry, you probably should, but make it good food. But if you're addicted to alcohol or drugs and you're angry and you're isolated, you're lonely, you're going to reach for, the relapse rate goes way up.
So what do you say to that person? Because neck and back problems are so common, even in young people, because they get injured physically, sports, anywhere. So what do you say to that person who doesn't even want to try drugs? They have the addicts in the family, whether they're recovered or not, they're too nervous, they don't even like pharmaceuticals. What can they do to find relief? Because a lot of the source I hear is that someone goes, they start taking something for a bad back, and then they there's a stressor. They lost a job, they got divorced, and then it sends it tail spinning into addiction.
Right. So realize, folks, that MDs, I am one, all we know to do when you have pain or an injury is give you either a pain pill or a muscle relaxant. Seriously, that's about all you're going to get. We just don't have any other tools. There are so many powerful tools to help you with pain and inflammation and injury. So I would start with turmeric as a natural substance you can eat, right? You can take it in capsule or naturally in your cooking. Huge anti-inflammatory. Quercetin is another one. All the antioxidants can help you heal much, much quicker. But if you've had a real injury, and let's say it's orthopedic, a really good chiropractor, acupuncture, massage with somebody who really understands how the body works, it can be so much. I mean, it's just like, okay, I had a back injury in college. I lifted a huge box of books, turned to go around the corner, and dropped. And I had a bulging disc, and I couldn't move for a few hours. And what did they give me? Pain pills and muscle relaxants. And of course, I augmented that with my alcohol back then. That might have been a start, actually, come to think of it. It was horrible. I have a bulging disc to this day. I haven't had surgery. I don't use opiates. When it starts flaring up, I go see a chiropractor, an adjustment, and I'm good. 1 or 2 adjustments. In my case, for that situation, I am good. There are so many better modalities than pain pills and muscle relaxants. That said, there are, like I started at the beginning with this horrible shoulder surgery, there's times where honestly I don't know how you'd survive without some pain medicine. If you're in a major car accident, you've got multiple broken bones, you don't need to worry about short-term use of opiates when you have just horrible pain, because it won't trigger any sort of euphoria or addictive type feelings. Just make sure you get off of it as faster than most people, right? So the surgeons know this shoulder surgery is a 2 to 3 month process to where the pain's manageable. I had sinus surgery a few years back. I was back to work in 3 days and off of pain meds in 5. It was just like, it was horrible, but it was different. I managed much better. So there's usually a track record for any given surgery of how long you should need pain meds. just make sure you're not getting past that window, or maybe you're falling into that trap where the withdrawal symptoms are starting to kick in and they're mimicking the pain.
Okay, now before we get into treatment recovery, I just want to talk about, you brought up such an interesting point about starting our young children on the path to addiction with these medications that they're using to try and help them with the ADD and the ADHD. Can you explain that a little bit, how it's kind of like a vicious circle?
That one is really tricky, Dara. So in my practice, I don't think I created all these ADD, ADHD kids, but I have a lot. I also have a lot of autistic kids because they find me. So just as an example, I started my integrative practice 10 years ago. I've been open for a little over 10 years, and I have 2,000 babies born into my practice. So I have 15,000 patients, but over the last 10 years, 2,000 babies actually born into my practice. Half of them approximately, I'm digressing just momentarily, but we'll come back to the point. Half of them are unvaccinated by parents' choice, and the other half are doing a slower schedule. I have only one autistic kid out of 2,000, and that kid's in the slightly vaccinated side. So that's different than the experience that others are having out in the real world, right? So the real world, you're having a much higher rate of autism, you're having a much higher rate of chronic disease. These kids are, frankly, plain old healthy. It's amazing. And it's not just the vaccine issue. I just pointed that out. I do informed consent, and parents make their own choices. Because we're also stressing vitamin D, we're stressing real food, we're stressing all these same things we've been talking about, reducing stress, exercise, sleep, etc. But that's an example of how things could be if we start right and do right. Now let me jump to the question. We've got this 1,000 patients who have ADD, ADHD. And the typical story, I had several this week. It's a 5, 6, 7-year-old who comes in, just had one yesterday, first visit for possible ADHD. And mom and dad are sitting there, and they're both, mom was on Ritalin for 10 years. Dad was super hyper, but never had Ritalin and doesn't really want it. He says, I managed. And I hear that every day. I was ADHD and I did fine, right? Well, here's the thing, parents. You, just like me, lived in a world that was less toxic. There's no question it's a more toxic world. You were less vaccinated. Lots of various factors that make the kids today have problems at a greater level. Just the severity is different. So just because you manage, don't necessarily put that on your kid if they're dying, right? They're struggling. So with that knowledge in place, I've got this kid in front of me who's clearly very hyper. They're all over the room, and they're pretty impulsive, but he's 5, right? I mean, he's just started kindergarten. And I said, how was it last year? He says, he did fine last year, but they moved from activity to activity pretty quickly. I said, all right, well, here's how I'd like to start. And we talk about, let's see if we have any risk factors, MTHFR, we can do some quick genetic testing. There's a neurotransmitter test available where you can check urine and you check levels of dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, glutamate, GABA. And you get a sense of their biochemistry. Are certain pathways shut down that we can just naturally support with, whether it's B vitamins? It depends on the pathway, and I've got a whole pathway sheet I can show them. So there are some natural things we can do, along with those 5 or 7 things we started off with, to see if we can help this child who has clearly hyperactivity, might qualify for the label, right? So I talk to parents about labels. I'm hyper. I do not go through life with a sign that says hyper on my forehead. I'm just Dr. Paul. Those who know me well know, yeah, he's hyper. But, your kid doesn't go around with a sign on their forehead, ADHD or ASD or whatever it may be. They're just your kid. And what we want to do is help them have success. So the usual pattern here in my practice is let's do everything we can natural and see if we can get function to a level where you're having success. Now, a little story on my son, Luke, my youngest one. He was the most affected in terms of just nobody home. he had some spectrum-y-like things, but he really didn't fit that full picture. He had a good social connection, but boy, other than that, there was just no one home. He was in third grade, about as ADHD as you could find a kid, honestly. And he came home one day and said, "Dad, I'm the dumbest kid in the class." It broke my heart because he's a smart kid. But he didn't feel smart because he was so distracted that he just misses things. I mean, the teacher gives directions, everybody else is doing their work, and he's looking out the window, and I don't know what he's doing, right? He misses it. Grades come back, and everybody else has A's and B's, and he's got red marks and D's and F's, whatever that may be. So you start owning this "I'm not very smart" thing. And so when I evaluate kids who are struggling with focus issues, ADD, ADHD, etc., find strengths to uplift and reinforce the fact that you're probably one of the smartest kids in the class, but your brain works different. We're going to help you figure out how to get your smarts to work for you. So we try all the natural things we possibly can. I'd say probably honestly about half the time that's not enough. And it's just, I think these kids are so, the combination of those factors of stresses and vulnerabilities, etc. So now you're in third or fourth or fifth or sixth grade, maybe seventh or eighth, when it really starts falling apart. Your child's failing in school. They're starting to turn to drugs and alcohol. These are the kids that do. Their self-esteem is in the toilet. They're not being successful. So they're isolating. They're reaching out for other relief. And we have found that untreated severe ADD, ADHD kids are the highest risk for becoming addiction patients. Properly treated, they don't, right? So I have this talk with my young preteens all the way through the teenage years. Every day of your life, you have a decision to make. You can go down this path of no drugs or alcohol, or you can choose drugs and alcohol. And I give them the example of my own kids and the stories from my practice. Those, even though it's rough, not drinking or doing drugs, those who go down this path of not drinking or doing drugs, they do great. They have good lives. Most of them are in college or getting jobs. They've got decent relationships. Almost every single one that chooses the drugs or alcohol path, they don't make it through high school or college. It's just a downward spiral because, and I'm like you, so I'll tell you this. This could have been my story. It's my kid's story. We're wired in such a way that we're going to love the effect. And we're going to just reach for that relief, and it's going to just take us down that pathway that's just going to destroy our lives. So that's a huge, important decision to just, you have to make it every day, though. I make the decision today, and then tomorrow, I think I'll just go. No, it's a choice you make every single day for the rest of your life, and you will have a good life. But back to managing their ADD, ADHD, there's a percentage of kids who, as long as they're not getting any negative side effects from stimulants, right? This is sort of where this was going. There's the Ritalin, methylphenidate group. There's the amphetamine, Adderall group. There's a few other meds that can be used that sometimes are helpful. I'm not going to have you on one of those meds unless the benefits are amazing. Everybody agrees they're amazing, including mom, dad, teacher, and kid. And your self-esteem's back and you're having success. That's a kid who's not going to go out and end up a drug addict, right? If I don't treat you and you're failing, what are you going to do? You're going to reach for relief somehow.
All right, so I want to talk, before we get into treatment, Dr. Paul way, I want to hear a little bit about myths. Can we talk a little bit about myths of recovery?
Sure. I list a few of them in the book there. I think, successful people don't become addicts. Well, I'm a clear example of that's not true. I was a very successful doctor. I mean, by the time I realized I was in trouble, I was the medical director of one of the hospitals. I was running case conferences. I had a huge practice. On the surface of things, I looked good, but I was dying inside. And if you have an addiction, whether it's food, substances, a behavior, you know what I'm talking about when you feel that emptiness inside. So that's something, anybody can be addicted. I mean, when you think about it, the food addiction and the fact that 2/3 of us are overweight. Another one, you have to be down and out to seek help. That one's a little tricky. So I've always been so success oriented that I didn't want to end up down and out. And I jumped off in time before I was down and out, and I was able to do that. Not easily, by the way. I tried many, many times to quit and couldn't. But eventually I was able to. For other people, you have to do an intervention. And that doesn't mean it's always going to work, right? Because an intervention is where they don't want to change, right? They don't want to change their behavior, but the loved ones see that this person's dying, right? We had to do that with my wife. Her story's in the book, so I think it's okay to talk about that. She was in real trouble, and hers was multiple surgeries on her jaw that led to opiate addictions because she was on so many opiates for so long, so many times. And she was getting to the point where I was nervous she wasn't going to make it. So we did an intervention, and thank goodness it stuck. So she also has 15 years recovery, and she's become the most beautiful person you could imagine. And, you know, so you never have to worry about giving up on somebody as far as that goes. What other myths? I don't have the book right in front of me. You could probably...
I don't either. I have my questions. I think you covered some of the big ones. So let's talk a little bit about Dr. Paul's way of addiction recovery. And I do want to mention, can you tell people that you do have a clinic that does an integrative practice towards addiction recovery, just in case somebody's interested to get more information or find out exactly, you know, what it's about?
Yeah. So my clinic is a small clinic you would have to live in Portland, Oregon, honestly, to be able to access that. And I'm focusing my clinic on 30 years old and under, because being a pediatrician as well, I just feel like I resonate best with the younger age group. I don't think I should be treating 60-year-old heroin addicts who have heart disease and bypass surgery and all that. I'm like, I don't know about that. So I know peds, I know addiction, but if you get older, I'm going to say no thanks. I did a summit this last summer, the Addiction Summit, and there's a website where you can actually go get access to that for free. So that's a thought for those of you who want more information on addiction. Honestly, I learned so much. I'd written the book. The book was just about to be published, and I did this summit, interviewed 27 different experts, and most of them were in this area of holistic healing, because I really wanted to highlight that. I think that's where the success is going to be lifelong and really powerful and meaningful. So just go to theaddictionsummit.com and you'll get access to 7 days free access to all that. You can own it too if you want, but just go check it out. There's some powerful interviews for that. Yeah, the management of treating the whole person, it just makes sense. You know, so many of us are struggling with more than just, say, your addiction. And so we've got to start healing the whole body, but mind, body, spirit, right? The whole thing. But here's what I will say. There is no one way. You've got to individualize it to you. And the other important thing is, don't wait to get it all right to get started. Just pick something, right? So when we were talking about the nutrition, that one, you're no way you're going to fix that. Boom. Oh, I fixed my diet. I cut out gluten and dairy, and I'm eating whole foods. They're all organic and they're fresh, and right? So pick something and start making progress. It's easy to add vitamin D. Just make a commitment to do that. You might be surprised that just that might make a difference. So in addition to those things, you want to start figuring out a way to not be isolating. And if there's anyone with opioid addiction in your life, or even just on chronic pain pills, the number 13 on my 13-point plan is have naloxone. I mean, that just sounds like, what's that? Well, with that 72,000 overdoses this last year, most of those people are either abusing opiates, like heroin or pain pills, or they're pain-type patients who have opiates. And pain is hard to live with, folks. And so depression is common when you're struggling with either addiction or pain. And if you're super depressed, suicide sometimes becomes a consideration. And it's tragic, right? So we don't know when these overdoses happen. I actually believe most overdoses are not suicide these days. It's the darn fentanyl. So they brought fentanyl into this country dirt cheap. It is over 100 times the strength of morphine, but there's carfentanil on the market that's 10,000 times the strength of morphine. A grain of salt of carfentanil added to your pain pill or added to your heroin will kill you. And so I think we're just wiping people out who have no idea what they're taking is going to do that to them. But if you stumble on your loved one and it's been less than 5 minutes since they overdosed and you have naloxone, you can just spray it up their nose. That's probably the version I would have you buy because it's by and large more affordable. There's some injectable kinds that are great, but they're like thousands of dollars. It's ridiculous. But anyway, having naloxone on hand if you have a loved one who either takes pain pills or is addicted to opiates is number 13 on my plan. Just worth doing.
Yeah, well, it's amazing to me that was approved by the FDA. The fact that so little can kill you. It's scary what's out there. So I just want to also mention, because you talk a lot about healthy diet, and we know that's the key to being healthy. It's one of those important things you could do is the choices that you make each day. But just explain why, because you're working on your gut microbiome, and why is that? I mean, I know with autism, I write all the people say in my book, like, heal the gut, heal the child. That's the saying. And it's the same that goes for every disease. Can you explain why? Because of the neurotransmitters, especially with addiction, that are in the gut and produced there.
Right. So the gut-brain connection, folks, is well known now. I mean, there's a lymphatic connection, direct connection with brain. The neurons are the neurotransmitters that are made, that are the addiction ones, are actually produced more heavily in the gut than in the brain. So when we talk dopamine, serotonin, all these things that have to do with mood and feel good, having balance in the gut will give you balance in your brain. So it is super, super important. And gut biome, think of it as a pond. I remember in high school biology, we would go scoop some water up from a pond and go look under the microscope, and there's just all these different things and organisms. Well, you have actually more cells in your gut from bacteria, etc., than in your entire body. It's when I hear that, it just blows my mind. But we are less human than we are bacteria as far as numbers of cells. If that diversity is in balance, it's very good for us. When it's out of balance, some people call that dysbiosis, you have an overabundance of something that maybe is secreting toxins, or maybe you're no longer making. So one of the roles of the bacteria in the gut is to make vitamins. Some of the B vitamins are made by our gut bacteria. And so you're deficient in something you don't even realize you're deficient in. So it helps both with nutrients, absorption and production of certain vitamins, but this balance of the immune system that it does is kind of important. There's a new field, I think I mentioned it briefly in my book, that's very, very exciting. I was just at a conference with a couple of the nation's leaders on using, this is going to gross people out, but anyway, you can use worms, like parasites, to train the immune system. So I grew up in Africa, and I always had this big belly as a little kid. I'm sure I was loaded with parasites. I mean, we used to swim in ponds that were like, I can't believe my parents allowed it. Actually, I don't think they even knew. I mean, in the village, kids just ran off, and you just let them. And I mean, the stuff we did, it would make most people cringe. But there's almost zero autoimmunity in cultures that have a lot of exposure to just parasites and all of that. And in our sterile world in the West, in the U.S., where food comes from a factory that's all sterilized and highly processed, there's no parasites there. We've lost all of that. And so we've lost the immune training and balance that used to occur. So Dr. William Parker at Duke University and Dr. Sid Baker in upstate New York, who speaks at most of the big autism conferences, they are both on the cutting edge of figuring out that you can use this little HDC, Hymenopterus cystic diminuta, don't worry about the fancy name. Basically, they're little rat tapeworms, but you don't give the tapeworm to the person. You give them a single-celled precursor of the tapeworm, and kids would take this, or an adult with autoimmunity or severe allergies or autism person would take this every couple weeks, and it's starting to rebalance the immune system. So if you have an autoimmune condition, something as silly as a single-cell precursor of a rat tapeworm can be transformative. That's mind-boggling. So this is sort of new stuff, but when you hear about microbiome, these are all the different varieties of bacteria. Some are helpful. Some of you may have heard of the Nemechek protocol that's being tried by a lot of parents for autism. Basically what he's doing, and I've actually had several patients have tremendous benefit from this, high-dose fish oil, super high-dose, omega-3 fatty acids, and inulin. So rather than probiotics, he gives inulin, which is a prebiotic that allows your gut bacteria to do well. And it's just a different a way of approaching gut health. And for some people, that works really well. I've had a few people, when you do prebiotics, they get worse, because if you really got a lot of dysbiosis, meaning the wrong bacteria, and you somehow support the wrong ones, things could tip in the wrong direction. But it's definitely something worth trying if you've got issues, gut-brain issues, or what you think is just brain, but you've forgotten that there may be a gut issue here. So you bring up an excellent point.
Yeah, no, I thought that was huge. I mean, there's so much important information in your book, and I love that you focused on that. So let's talk a little bit about where people can get your book, because I urge people, I don't have addiction in my family, although my husband does use a smartphone way too much, but I found it so useful, the information, and certainly for anybody who's struggling or knows someone who's struggling with addiction, they should get your book, they should read the information and just do the baby steps, even if they can't go right to recovery right away, but to do the things to get on the journey to feeling better is the road to recovery. So Let's talk about where they can find both your books, because I know there's probably people watching who have children or grandchildren, and I'm sure they'd be very interested as well in the vaccine-friendly book.
Yes. So they're both available anywhere books are sold. Obviously Amazon, they're both on Amazon, but you can go to any bookstore. The Addiction Spectrum, being a new book, I'm sure will be on the shelves. The Vaccine Friendly, it would depend. It's interesting, that one. I think it's because it's controversial. It doesn't always stay on the shelves, but any bookstore can order it for you, or you can get it on Amazon.
And I love it's not an all or nothing approach. You expect that people might relapse. You expect that this isn't going to happen overnight. So I think it's a very user-friendly road to recovery. It's not set up for failure. It's set up for success. And that's what I found so inspiring about it.
Well, thank you, Dara. I think people, we struggled with what to call this book, right? So do we even put the word addiction in there, because it comes so loaded and people think, oh, I don't have a problem with addiction, or I don't want to look at that, right? Because this book is about so much more. I mean, as I said, 2/3 of us struggle with food in one way or another. So 20 million Americans are addicted, whether it's alcohol, drugs, and half of those people are in recovery. The other half are still struggling. And if you include the families affected by those 20 million people, it's almost half of the country. So this is a book for everyone, because I think, first of all, you'll be intrigued to hear a doctor actually spilling his guts about his own addiction. Like, wow, that's different. And I even exposed a couple of my family members with their permission, of course. And then names are changed, but you've got some stories of amazing stories from my practice. So it's an easy read. It's touchable. And then there's practical steps that each and every one of us should implement in our lives, whether you're dealing with addiction or any other chronic disease, or whether you just want to stay healthy, period.
I agree. I mean, I found for me personally, it was very rewarding. Just all the reminders, you can't just focus on the food. Make sure you're also getting adequate exercise and stress reduction. So it really is a wonderful, positive approach. And I thank you so much for being on the Every Choice Counts podcast. This was really a wonderful interview.
Thanks for having me, Dara. My pleasure.